we're going to move on to the combat and movement of Dark Souls 2, because this is a section that I've done a lot of research into this, because when I first played Dark Souls 2, something fell off, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And then I did a lot of research, I did a lot of testing, I did a lot of comparison between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 to figure out what it was that made Dark Souls 2 feel so different. And it's a lot of different factors that all come together to make the combat feel so strange in Dark Souls 2 and the movement feel so strange. So this is a list of all of the different factors which sort of play into making Dark Souls 2 feel inferior to other games. First of all, there is a massive stamina delay after you execute actions. So whenever you attack, if you use up all your stamina, there's a massive delay before it even starts regenerating. When it regenerates, when it actually starts to regenerate, it regenerates fast. But the delay between when you run out of stamina and use it, and then when it regenerates, that delay is about twice as long as Dark Souls 1. It's a massive difference. Then also movement in general is slower. Your character moves slower than in other games. Attacks take longer. Rolls take longer. Everything is slower. When you walk slower. You run slower. When you sprint slower. Everything is slower in Dark Souls 2. Additionally, after you commit to an action, like an attack, there is a massive delay before you can roll or do anything. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, there is no real delay. So, for example, if you attack an enemy and then try and quickly dodge out the way for if he does a follow-up attack. So you attack and then you try and dodge. You have to attack, wait a second, and then you can roll away. And that makes the whole game, it changes everything, because Dark Souls is about those really fast, quick actions, quick reaction times. You've got to quickly try and dodge an enemy's attack, and sometimes things can be down to the frames. Literally, if you dodge a frame earlier, it can mean you take damage. Or if you dodge a frame later, it can mean you take damage. Everything is like that in Dark Souls, and in Dark Souls 1, you attack, and then literally the second your animation for the attack is finished, you can roll. But in Dark Souls 2, you have to attack, wait for the animation to finish, then wait for your character to sort of return to his normal standing position. Then you can roll to dodge. This slows everything down. And there's a massive delay before your character basically executes any action in Dark Souls 2. Additionally, if you press the button to use an item, it doesn't queue up that action like it does in Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring or Bloodborne. Usually if you're attacking and then you press the button to use an item like an Estus Flask, it will queue up that action so that once your character is finished committing the attack, then it will use the item. In Dark Souls 2 that doesn't happen. So literally, if you want to heal after attacking after attack, spam the button to use your Estus Flask. Just spam it, press. And then hope that you manage to press it after your character technically finished the attack. Because if you press it before your character technically finished the attack, your character just won't do anything. They just won't use the item. On top of this, the hitboxes of enemies are really bad in this game. So sometimes you can roll to dodge an attack, but then, oh no, that enemy has a massive hitbox, and even though you were literally nowhere near the sword, it still counts as doing damage for some reason, because the hitboxes are so massive. On top of this, we have rolling being tied to the iframes with the adaptability statistic. So that means that sometimes, if you haven't leveled up adaptability as much, you have less iframes. Sometimes you can have more iframes, but sometimes you have less. And this as a whole also just changes everything. And having adaptability be tied to how quickly you use items also means everything feels slower, because when your adaptability isn't faster, you use items slower, which also slows the whole game down. Also, something else, when you roll and then commit to an attack, your character doesn't automatically change the direction of their attack to face the enemy that you're locked onto. In Dark Souls 1, if you're locked onto an enemy and then roll, your character after the roll will automatically face the enemy that you are locked onto, which means if you attack, your attack will actually hit the enemy. But in Dark Souls 2, you roll, your character can be facing the other way. And you press an attack, and oh no, your character attacks some invisible enemy behind them because for some reason they're facing the wrong way. Again, this slows the gameplay down. It means that after you roll, you have to wait and then turn your character around and then attack. You have to wait all this time just to do something. Now, sometimes as well, smaller enemies will sometimes deal damage to you in Dark Souls 2 the split second the animation started, not when the weapon hits you, which means sometimes you can kill an enemy, but because their animation of their weapon coming to hit you and deal damage started, even though the weapon didn't hit you, just because that animation started, it means that you take damage, which can sometimes mean you die. On top of all of this, Dark Souls 2 changed the joystick dead zones, which means that the movement of your character feels different and you have less control, less fine control over the movement of your character in Dark Souls 2 compared to every other game in the series. So, Dark Souls 2 uses something called square joystick dead zones, whereas every other game in the series uses circular joystick dead zones, which means that square dead zones just means that the shape of the pattern to control the different fine movements your character makes when you are trying to move your character diagonally, or turn them around to the left, or turn them around diagonally again. Square dead zones means that you have less control over the diagonal movement of your character, whereas circular dead zones means that you have more control over the diagonal movement of the character. This also translates to the camera movement as well, which means that when you're moving the camera, you might move it really quick in certain places, but then slower in other places. This is because of it's called joystick dead zones. And Dark Souls 2, as I said, uses square joystick dead zones, whereas other games in the series use circular joystick dead zones. It's a small thing, but it means that when you're trying to move your character diagonally, it means that you have less control over your character's movement diagonally. And this can be when you're sprinting, this could be in combat when you're trying to run away from an enemy, or run around an enemy, or dodge to diagonally, all this kind of stuff. It means that sometimes you'll try and roll diagonally, but your character will just roll to the left, or forward, or backwards when you're trying to roll diagonally. So, what I've tried to say here is that the combination of all of these different factors means that Dark Souls 2 has a very different feel to every other game in the series, and in my opinion, it's considerably worse than every other game in the series. A few things here are down to personal preference, but some of them I think are just objectively worse. Luckily, there are now mods which fix a lot of these problems. There's a mod, for example, to change the joystick dead zones. A mod which changes the stamina system to be in line with Dark Souls 1. A mod which fixes some of the enemy hitboxes. And a mod which changes the direction of your attack after you roll. But I think, unfortunately, no amount of mods can completely fix the fundamental problems with Dark Souls 2's movement and combat systems. And I think, unfortunately, for me, this whole list of all these different things I've said here is what combines together to make Dark Souls 2 just fundamentally an inferior game to me than every other game in the series. It took a while for me to fully understand, because I had to try and look into all the different things that just don't quite work. Because Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, they have a distinct feel. And Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 have a distinct feel as well, which is more in line with Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2 just feels like such an outlier. I could tell the second I started moving the character and just moving them around and feeling the way the game played, I could tell straight away something was off. And I think because of this is the reason why, unless Dark Souls 2 was literally your first game in the series, if Dark Souls 2 was your first game, then you were used to all this. This is what you knew. This is how the game played for you when you first played Dark Souls. But for me, because I played all the other games first, and because I love all the other games, and the other games have sort of set that standard, Dark Souls 2 and the clunky feeling of it just doesn't work for me. And I think it's the reason why it will never be one of my favourite games. But anyway, now, let's go back to talking about the areas.